He came back to the town quietly as if he had never left. The small town was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and people noticed when someone was new, or when someone returned after many years. The streets smelled faintly of pine and dust, and the air carried the faint hum of summer insects. He drove slowly past the houses he remembered from his childhood. Some were worn and faded, others looked newly painted, but they all carried the same quiet, almost sleepy, feeling that had always been part of this town. He parked his car in front of the house that had once belonged to his family. It had been empty for a long time, waiting for someone to bring life back to it. Now with him there, it seemed to breathe again. The windows reflected the golden afternoon sun, and the lawn, though a little overgrown, reminded him of the days he had played there as a boy. Memories washed over him, some pleasant, some painful. He remembered the friends he had as a child, the small adventures through the woods, and the evenings sitting on the porch listening to his mother tell stories. But he also remembered the whispers, the stares, and the times when being different made life hard. He got out of the car slowly, taking in the quiet around him. For a long time he had lived in other places far from this town, places filled with noise, chaos, and constant movement. Those places had been exciting, but they had never felt like home. Coming back here brought a strange mix of comfort and unease. The streets were familiar, yet he knew the town had changed, and he had changed too. He carried with him a part of the world that most people here would never understand. A life built on discipline, courage, and the kind of training that could make someone almost unstoppable. But no one here would know that. To them, he was just a man returning to his hometown. He went inside the house, letting the door click softly behind him. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that almost made him uneasy. He moved through the rooms, touching the walls as if he could feel the past lingering there. Each room held a memory. A birthday party, a game played on the floor, a Christmas morning. He smiled faintly at the recollections, but a shadow of caution stayed with him. Coming back meant reconnecting with people, but it also meant facing the town he had left behind, a town that had never been entirely welcoming to someone like him. Over the next few days, he began settling in. He cleaned the house, fixed broken hinges, and repaired the small things that needed attention. The routine helped him feel grounded. He went to the local store, bought groceries, and started reconnecting with the few familiar faces who still lived there. Some remembered him from years ago. Some only knew of him from stories. People were polite, but he could feel a subtle distance, a quiet curiosity mixed with caution. He had learned over the years to read people like an open book, and he noticed it immediately. Not everyone in the town welcomed him. A small group of people who had always made life harder for others who were different began noticing him quickly. They whispered among themselves, casting glances when they thought no one was looking. They were a family of men who had lived in the town for generations, men who believed they had a right to control who belonged and who didn't. They had long made it clear that anyone who looked different, who acted different, or who had the courage to stand tall would be questioned and sometimes harassed. They saw him now, a strong, quiet man, and decided he would be an easy target. He noticed them too, though he never let it show. He had learned to be aware of danger long before returning to this town. Every movement, every glance, every small change in the way people behaved registered in his mind. He remembered his training, years of preparation that taught him to stay calm, observe, and think clearly under pressure. But he also remembered his life before that, a life of normal struggles, fears, and hopes. Returning here reminded him that danger did not always come from faraway lands or the battlefield. It could come from the people you passed every day, quietly, without warning. The first encounter was subtle. One afternoon, he was walking down the main street carrying groceries. A group of men drove by slowly, their eyes following him. They made a few crude gestures, muttered something under their breath, and laughed. He ignored them, keeping his pace steady and his expression calm. He knew that showing fear, anger, or reaction would only encourage them. They wanted to see a response, a crack in his armor, but he had learned long ago that patience and control were often stronger than force. He continued walking, greeting the shopkeeper with a nod, paying no attention to the laughter fading behind him. Days turned into weeks, and the tension grew quietly. The men watched him, trying to understand who he was, why he had returned, and how they could provoke him. They began leaving notes on his car, scrawled with threats and insults. They vandalized the mailbox, tipped over trash cans, and spread rumors through the town. People in the town began noticing, whispering about the quiet man who seemed calm no matter what happened. Some admired him secretly, impressed by his composure. Others were cautious, unsure what to expect. Through it all, he remained calm. He knew the world worked in strange ways. Some threats were easy to handle with skill. Others required patience and careful planning. He never revealed what he had been trained to do, the missions he had led or the skills he had mastered. He carried the weight of his past quietly, like a hidden armor no one could see. Most people would never guess the truth about him. To them, he was just a man trying to live quietly in a town that had its own rules and expectations. At night, he would sit on the porch, listening to the soft hum of crickets and the occasional distant bark of a dog. The town seemed peaceful then, but he knew better. He had learned that danger often hid behind calm faces and friendly greetings. He watched the stars and thought about the balance between caution and courage, between patience and action. He knew that eventually, the quiet tension would rise to a moment where decisions would have to be made. But he was ready. He always had been. He also remembered why he had returned. It wasn't just to live in the town again. It was to claim his space, to show that fear and hatred could not push him out. He had survived wars, missions that required split-second decisions and unimaginable courage. And he knew that his strength was not only in his body but in his mind and heart. Living quietly here was a new kind of mission, one that required strategy, awareness, and a calm determination. The town would learn in time that he was not someone to underestimate. The group that watched him began planning more aggressively. They thought that by cornering him, by showing force, they could intimidate him into leaving. They did not understand that he had been trained to survive situations far more dangerous than their threats. He noticed the preparations, their movements, the way they spoke in hushed tones when they thought no one was watching. He stayed alert but never acted prematurely. Every move they made he recorded in his mind, waiting for the moment when it would matter. Despite the tension, he also found moments of normal life. He walked through the fields behind his house, the tall grass swaying in the wind. He visited the local diner, sharing small talk with the owner and a few familiar faces. He went to the library, reading quietly among the shelves, losing himself in books about history, strategy, and human behavior. These small routines helped him stay grounded, reminding him that even in a town filled with tension, life continued. He found comfort in the simple rhythms, the everyday acts of living, knowing they gave him strength for the challenges ahead. At the same time, he reached out to the community quietly. He helped a neighbor fix a fence, gave advice on car repairs, and shared stories with the children about the woods and animals, careful never to reveal too much about his past. People began to notice his kindness, his intelligence, and his calm demeanor. Slowly, some hearts began to change. Some saw that he was not a man to fear or hate, but a man of integrity, strength, and wisdom. Yet others only grew more suspicious, seeing him as a challenge to their sense of control. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, he sat on the porch, watching the shadows stretch across the lawn. He thought about the weeks since his return, the quiet tension and the subtle warnings he had received. He knew that the situation could escalate at any time, but he also knew that fear was not an option. He had learned to face challenges directly with patience, clarity, and strategy. The town did not know who he really was, and that gave him an advantage. He could act when the time was right. In the quiet of the evening, he allowed himself a small smile. Life here was different from the missions he had led, but it required the same qualities: focus, awareness, and courage. He felt a deep sense of purpose, knowing that by standing his ground he was making a statement, not through violence but through presence, strength, and calm resolve. The town might not understand it yet, but soon they would learn that he was not a man to be underestimated. As night fell, he went inside, closing the door softly behind him. The house was quiet, but he felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. The past with all its memories had shaped him, and the present with all its challenges was testing him. He was ready for whatever came next, and though he moved through the town quietly, people who truly paid attention would notice the energy around him, the quiet confidence that came from a life lived with discipline and courage. He had returned to his hometown, a place full of memories, challenges, and hidden dangers, and he was ready. Life in the town began to settle into a rhythm, but the quiet tension never left him. Each day he went about his routines, fixing things around the house, walking through the streets, greeting the neighbors. But the feeling of being watched never went away. The group of men who had taken notice of him grew bolder. They didn't speak directly to him yet, but their presence was always felt. Cars would slow down as they passed. A few would follow at a distance, and whispers floated through the town like invisible threads. They were testing him, trying to see how he would react, thinking that one day he would make a mistake. One morning, he was tending to the garden behind his house when he noticed tire tracks in the dirt. They weren't random. They circled the property, moving slowly, watching. He didn't panic. Instead, he studied them, noting the type of vehicle, the way the tires moved, the speed. Small details told him a lot. These were not strangers who didn't know what they were doing. They were careful, organized, and confident. That only made him more cautious. He kept working quietly, letting the movements of the intruders become part of the background. Patience had always been his strongest weapon. By midweek, the harassment became more personal. Someone slashed a tire on his car and left a note tucked under the windshield wiper. The message was simple but clear: leave or face consequences. He picked up the note and read it carefully. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike, but the words carried a heavy threat. He didn't burn it, didn't crumple it, didn't respond in anger. He placed it in a folder and continued with his day. He knew every act of aggression had to be recorded, remembered, and understood. This was no longer just casual harassment. It was the beginning of something more dangerous. That evening, he visited the local store. The owner greeted him warmly, but there was tension in the air. A group of men lingered near the entrance, watching him. He smiled politely, paid for his items, and left without a word. They followed him briefly in their truck, slowly, waiting for an opportunity to corner him. But he noticed their movement immediately. Instead of reacting, he allowed them to circle the block once before returning home. He made sure he wasn't being lured into an isolated street. He understood patterns and timing. He understood that aggression without planning was risky, but aggression with strategy could be deadly. At night, he would sit on his porch and watch the stars. It was a way to calm himself, a way to feel connected to something bigger than the immediate threats around him. He thought about the people in the town who were afraid to speak up, and those who had grown silent over the years. Fear had its own power, but he refused to let fear dictate his life. He had lived through situations that would have broken most men, and he knew he could endure this too. What he needed was awareness, patience, and the right moment to act. The men, frustrated by his lack of visible reaction, decided to escalate. One afternoon, a group of them cornered him near the edge of town while he was walking back from the market. They were loud, shouting insults and taunts, trying to provoke him. But he didn't flinch. His movements remained calm, measured, controlled. He didn't speak, only observed, noticing the smallest gestures. The way their hands hovered near their pockets, the rhythm of their breathing, the tension in their shoulders. Every detail told a story. He understood instinctively what they intended without them saying a word. They shouted more aggressively, waving their fists and threatening him. A crowd began to gather, some curious, some scared. People whispered to each other, wondering if he would fight back. But he didn't move in anger. Instead, he shifted slightly, creating a small distance between himself and them. His eyes met theirs, calm and unwavering, and without a single word he conveyed that he was aware, that he was ready, and that he was not afraid. For the first time, some of the men faltered, uncertain if their intimidation would succeed. After a tense moment, the leader of the group gestured, and they backed off, mumbling threats under their breath. He continued walking slowly, not showing relief or fear, only calm determination. People watched, impressed but unsure what they had just witnessed. In that moment, he had established something important. He could be approached, but he could not be bullied. And the men who thought they were in control began to doubt themselves. The next few days brought more subtle harassment. Someone left a broken bottle on his front steps. Another time, they threw paint over the mailbox. They tried to scare him with loud noises late at night, and even attempted to cut the power to his house for a few hours. Each act was carefully calculated to provoke fear, but he treated them as lessons, analyzing their behavior, learning their routines, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. He began noticing patterns in their attacks, timing, location, and method. It wasn't random. It was organized. He also began reaching out quietly to those he could trust. A few neighbors had always respected him, though they had been too timid to confront the harassment themselves. He shared small pieces of advice about staying aware, about watching behavior, about noticing the little things that could signal danger. People started listening, and that small awareness began spreading quietly through the neighborhood. It was subtle, but it created a web of vigilance. One afternoon, while he was working in the garage, he heard a commotion outside. The group had parked in front of his house, blocking his driveway. They shouted insults and threats, confident that they could corner him. He walked outside calmly, hands empty, eyes steady. They expected panic, expected rage, expected a fight. Instead, he simply observed, watching their movements, their expressions, their coordination. He understood immediately what they were trying to do, force him into a corner where they could attack. But he wasn't the man they thought they knew. In a few careful, controlled movements, he disarmed the situation. He blocked their access to the driveway without raising his voice or resorting to violence. He forced them to back up, creating distance while maintaining complete calm. Each action was precise, measured, and intentional. To an outsider, it might have seemed like luck or charisma, but it was skill, training, and awareness in action. By the evening, news of the confrontation had spread through the town. Some people were amazed by the calm and confidence he displayed. Others were unsettled, unsure what they had witnessed. The group that had harassed him grew frustrated. They had expected fear, not strategy. They had expected anger, not control. And they had certainly not expected him to see through their plans so easily. Despite the escalation, he never sought revenge. He did not confront them with anger, nor did he try to publicly humiliate them. He understood that patience, observation, and control were more powerful than aggression. He recorded every encounter in his mind, remembering details for future use. Each act of harassment became a piece of a larger puzzle. Each movement, word, and gesture of the group told him what they valued, what they feared, and how far they were willing to go. In quieter moments, he would walk through the woods behind his property, reflecting on his life. He remembered the missions he had led, the decisions he had made under extreme pressure, and the lessons those experiences had taught him. But he also remembered simpler times, playing in the fields as a child, running through the streets of this town, the laughter of friends long gone. Those memories reminded him of why he had returned. He wasn't just defending himself, he was claiming his place, showing that courage, intelligence, and integrity mattered more than fear and hatred. As the days passed, the men's efforts became more desperate. They tried to catch him alone, leaving notes at odd hours, attempting to provoke him in public spaces and even trying to enlist others to intimidate him. But he remained calm, measured, and prepared. People in the town began to notice a shift. The whispers about his past, his discipline, and his confidence began spreading quietly. Some began to respect him, some began to fear him, and others simply watched, waiting to see what would happen next. He never underestimated the danger. He knew that their desperation could lead to violence. He also knew that reacting too quickly or recklessly could play into their hands. Every step, every decision was deliberate. He moved through the town with awareness, blending ordinary life with careful preparation. By doing so, he made sure that if the situation escalated, he would be ready, not out of anger, but out of necessity. At night, he sat on the porch again, listening to the wind rustling the trees and the faint hum of distant traffic. He thought about the men who were trying to push him out, the town that had once looked at him with suspicion, and the life he had returned to reclaim. He felt a deep sense of purpose. This was not just about surviving. It was about standing tall, about showing that intelligence, discipline, and courage could overcome fear and prejudice. The town was watching, the group was watching, and he was ready, not because he wanted a fight, but because he had to be ready. In his mind, every detail was important, every movement counted, and every choice mattered. The tension in the town was growing, and it was only a matter of time before it reached a point where calm and patience would no longer be enough. But he was prepared. He always had been. And so life continued, each day a careful balance between ordinary routines and extraordinary vigilance. The group continued their harassment. The town continued to watch, and he continued to prepare. The quiet man who had returned to the small town was no longer just a resident. He was a presence, a force, a reminder that courage and intelligence often appeared in the most unexpected places. The stage was set. The tension was building, and the moment when everything would come to a head was drawing closer with every passing day. The tension that had been quietly building for weeks finally reached a breaking point. The group that had been harassing him had grown more reckless with each passing day. Their whispers, threats, and small acts of intimidation were no longer enough. They wanted action, a confrontation, something that would prove their power. They believed they could corner him, that he would finally show fear. But he had been preparing for this moment quietly, patiently, for weeks. It was a warm evening when it happened. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the streets, and the air carried the scent of grass and dust. He was walking home from the small diner at the edge of town, carrying a bag with a few groceries and a book he had borrowed from the library. The streets were mostly empty, a few cars passing by slowly, the occasional neighbor finishing an evening walk. He noticed movement out of the corner of his eye, a truck slowing as it approached, the familiar silhouettes of the men who had been watching him for weeks. They blocked the street ahead, stepping out of the truck with aggressive movements, hands raised, voices loud. They shouted insults and threats, clearly expecting him to react with fear or anger. Some of them carried bats, others made gestures as if to intimidate. He stopped in the middle of the street, setting the bag down carefully. His movements were deliberate, calm, controlled. There was no panic in his eyes, no hesitation. Every step, every glance, every breath he took was measured. He studied them quickly, noting their positions, the distance between them, their body language. The leader of the group stepped forward, trying to assert dominance. "Thought you could just come back here and act like you belong," he shouted, his voice rough, dripping with aggression. "Time to teach you a lesson." The others moved closer, circling slightly, their eyes fixed on him, looking for any sign of weakness. He didn't respond verbally. Instead, he shifted slightly to one side, subtly adjusting the angle of his body, aware of every potential escape route, every object that could provide cover if needed. He could feel the adrenaline beginning to rise, but he kept it in check. Years of training had taught him that the key to surviving a confrontation wasn't in rushing or reacting impulsively. It was in observation, anticipation, and precision. He recognized their pattern immediately. They were trying to provoke him into a reaction, to give them an excuse to escalate. He refused to give them that. Instead, he watched calmly, waiting for the moment when their overconfidence would create an opening. One of them swung a bat at him suddenly, assuming he would dodge clumsily or panic. But he moved with instinct and skill, stepping back just enough to let the bat pass harmlessly. In the same movement, he grabbed the bag of groceries and dropped it behind him, using it as a minor distraction. The men were momentarily thrown off, surprised by his control and timing. He could see the confusion in their eyes. They had expected fear, not precision. They had expected chaos, not calm. The leader lunged again, this time trying to grab him by the arm. He twisted smoothly, using the man's momentum against him, guiding him forward and off balance. The others tried to rush in, but he moved fluidly, sidestepping and creating space. Every motion was deliberate, economical, without unnecessary force. He wasn't fighting for anger or revenge. He was controlling the situation, neutralizing the immediate threat without causing permanent harm. By now, some neighbors had noticed the commotion. A few came cautiously out of their houses, peeking from behind walls and fences, unsure what they were witnessing. Some whispered to each other, recognizing that this man was extraordinary, that his calm and skill were beyond what anyone could expect. They had seen the tension grow for weeks, but now, seeing him handle the attack with such precision, they realized that he was no ordinary resident. The group began to realize their mistake. Their confidence wavered as he moved, fluid and controlled, reading each movement before it happened. One man tried to swing again, this time from behind, but he spun with perfect balance, redirecting the arm harmlessly, and took a step back, keeping his distance. The men started shouting, their coordination breaking down. Panic began to replace their arrogance. They had assumed the confrontation would be simple, that their numbers would intimidate him. They were wrong. He knew the confrontation could escalate quickly if he lost focus. He continued to control space, to observe every action, every glance, every subtle shift in weight. In his mind, he calculated outcomes, predicting their next moves before they could make them. The leader, now clearly frustrated, tried a more aggressive approach, moving directly at him with a bat raised high. In a smooth, controlled motion, he sidestepped, causing the leader to stumble slightly and use the momentum to gently but firmly push him to the ground. The others froze for a moment, unsure what to do. Their aggression had failed, and their leader was momentarily humbled. He didn't attack them further. He simply stood, calm and unshaken, making it clear through body language that any further attempt would be equally futile. It was a display of control, skill and presence, something that left them in shock. They began muttering among themselves, glancing at each other nervously. They had underestimated him completely. At that moment, he noticed something else. The people who had been watching from their homes were beginning to step forward cautiously. Some called the police. Others simply stood at a distance, witnessing what had happened. The presence of witnesses added another layer of control. He maintained his calm, aware that public attention could prevent the situation from escalating further, while also reinforcing the idea that he was not someone to threaten lightly. After a few tense minutes, the group backed away slowly, muttering threats that lacked conviction. They returned to their truck, unsure what to do next, and drove off. He watched them leave, calm, composed, and fully aware of every detail, every expression, every hesitation. This confrontation was over for now, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they tried something else. He had prepared for this, and he had handled it. The lesson had been delivered without unnecessary violence, but the town had begun to understand that this man was not to be trifled with. Later that evening, he cleaned up the small mess from the encounter. Broken grocery items, a scuffed porch, a few dents in the driveway. It was nothing compared to what could have happened if he had lost control. He worked quietly, methodically, his mind calm and focused. He reflected on what had happened, analyzing the movements, the mistakes, and the psychology of the group. Every detail mattered. He had learned as much from this confrontation as they had, though in very different ways. He also thought about the town. The residents had seen a glimpse of what he was capable of, though they didn't know the full extent. That knowledge, or even the hint of it, would spread slowly, reshaping perceptions. People began to see him not just as a quiet man returning home, but as someone capable, disciplined, and fearless. It was a subtle shift but powerful. Respect once earned quietly through observation was far more enduring than fear or intimidation. The next morning, he walked through the streets again, noticing the absence of the group. Their presence had been a constant threat, but now, at least temporarily, they were gone. People greeted him more openly, some with a smile, some with cautious curiosity. The small encounters he had had in the past weeks were now framed by the knowledge of what he could do. Some whispered about his past, speculating, but no one dared approach him aggressively. He spent the day reinforcing his property, checking the surroundings, and making small adjustments to his routines. His calm, quiet vigilance had become part of his daily life. He knew that confrontation might happen again, and he was ready. He also knew that control, awareness, and patience were just as important as skill and strength. He had shown restraint, and that restraint would define him as much as his capability. By evening, he returned to the porch, the quiet hum of the town around him. The sky was painted with shades of pink and gold, and the air carried the faint scent of evening flowers. He sat, reflecting on the confrontation, the lessons learned, and the challenges that might still come. He knew the group would recover, would plan, and would try again. But he also knew that he had set the rules of engagement. They could test him, but they could not intimidate him. As night fell, he remained alert yet calm. The stars above reminded him that life was larger than any one conflict. Yet the immediate challenge, the group that had tried to provoke him, to test him, to harm him, was now a problem he had solved with skill, patience, and discipline. He had shown strength without anger, courage without recklessness, and control without malice. The town, silently or openly, was beginning to notice. He understood that this was only one confrontation, the first in what could be a series. But he also knew that preparation, awareness, and calm resolve would always give him the advantage. The men who had tried to corner him had learned an important lesson, and the town had learned a lesson too. He was not just a resident, he was someone who could not be intimidated, someone whose presence demanded respect. And so the night settled, quiet once more, with him sitting calmly on the porch, aware, prepared, and ready for whatever would come next. The confrontation had ended, but the story was far from over. He would continue to watch, to learn, and to protect the life he had returned to reclaim, and when the next challenge came, he would face it with the same calm, precise strength that had carried him through this one. The town was buzzing the next morning, though not with excitement or joy. People moved quietly, speaking in hushed tones, glancing toward the house where he lived. The confrontation from the previous evening had spread through the streets like wildfire, first as whispers, then as speculation, and finally as the uneasy understanding that something remarkable had happened. Those who had seen the events firsthand struggled to put them into words, while those who had only heard secondhand stories tried to imagine what kind of man could handle an aggressive group of people with such calm and control. He moved through the town as he always did, quietly, deliberately, aware of every glance and every tone of voice. A few neighbors nodded at him, offering small smiles of encouragement, while others watched from a distance, curious or cautious. The air was thick with tension, but also with a subtle sense of respect. The knowledge of his composure and skill had begun to shift the perception of those around him. People who had once feared conflict were starting to wonder whether the town had underestimated him all along. The men who had confronted him the night before were now careful. Their confidence had been shaken, their arrogance chipped away. They had assumed that fear was something everyone could feel, something that would keep him in line. They had been wrong, and the realization unsettled them deeply. They avoided him in public, spoke in lower tones, and tried to maintain appearances as if nothing had happened. But the change in their behavior was clear to anyone paying attention. They had lost control and they knew it. Law enforcement soon became involved, though the officers had been cautious at first. Reports came in about the confrontation, the threats, and the public nature of the altercation. He provided his account calmly, describing the events with clarity without exaggeration, and with an emphasis on the truth of what had occurred. The officers were surprised by his composure and thoroughness. They took notes, asked questions, and began investigating the group's prior behavior. They discovered a history of harassment and intimidation aimed at other residents, confirming that this was not an isolated incident. The evidence he had quietly collected over the past weeks, photographs of vandalism, notes left on his property, and a detailed record of each encounter, proved invaluable. The authorities were able to take action, issuing warnings and initiating legal proceedings against the most aggressive members of the group. It was a slow process, but it sent a message that harassment would not be tolerated, and that the town could no longer ignore the actions of those who sought to intimidate others. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood began to shift in subtle ways. People who had previously remained silent or indifferent started to speak up. They discussed safety, awareness, and the importance of standing together. Some residents admitted that they had once feared retribution from the group, but now felt emboldened to act because they had seen the strength and courage of one man who refused to back down. Conversations that had been whispered behind closed doors now took place openly, and the quiet sense of community that had long been missing began to emerge. He did not seek praise or recognition. He continued his daily routines as before, fixing his house, walking through town, engaging with neighbors in quiet, friendly conversations, but now there was a new awareness around him. People watched not with fear, but with a mixture of curiosity and respect. They saw a man who handled danger without anger, who exercised control without cruelty, and who used intelligence as his greatest weapon. It was a lesson in courage and restraint, one that the town would not forget. Children began to notice him differently as well. Some had played near his house before, but now they approached with caution, watching his calm movements and quiet strength. He offered small gestures of encouragement, a nod, a smile, a brief story about the woods or the local animals. In doing so, he showed them that strength did not have to be loud or aggressive, and that confidence came from knowledge, awareness, and self-control. Even the youngest residents began to learn in their own way that courage could take many forms. The group that had confronted him continued to be cautious, but they were not silent. They whispered among themselves, planning their next moves, unsure how to regain their sense of dominance. They underestimated the long-term effect of their failure. He did not need to pursue them or strike back. His calm, deliberate actions had already reshaped the balance of power. Their intimidation tactics were losing meaning, their confidence fading, and their threats carried less weight. The town, having witnessed the outcome, began to see them differently as well. The perception of control had shifted, and that shift was powerful. He also began to interact more with the local authorities, not in a confrontational way, but to offer insights and advice. His observations of the group's behavior, their movements, and their psychology provided valuable information. He did not boast of his past or reveal the full extent of his training, but the knowledge he shared was enough to help prevent future incidents. His presence became a stabilizing force in the town, a quiet reminder that vigilance, intelligence, and courage could protect a community without the need for constant aggression. Even the families who had once been afraid to speak openly began to feel safer. Parents allowed their children to play outside without worry, and neighbors spoke more freely, discussing their experiences and concerns. There was a growing sense of collective awareness, a subtle but meaningful shift in the town's dynamic. Fear was no longer the dominant force. It was replaced by respect for the man who had faced danger without hesitation, and by the awareness that standing together, with clarity and courage, could make a difference. In the days past, he also took small steps to strengthen his own position. He walked through the streets, aware of every movement and sound, noting potential blind spots and exits. He reinforced his property quietly, adding security measures that were subtle but effective. He never flaunted his skills or sought attention. Instead, he used his discipline to maintain calm control over his surroundings. This preparation was not out of paranoia, but out of understanding. The town had its tensions, and awareness was the key to maintaining safety. He also began spending time with people who were willing to listen and learn. Older residents who had lived in the town for decades shared stories about past conflicts, about lessons learned and mistakes made. Younger residents asked questions, curious about the man who had handled the confrontation so calmly. He responded carefully, sharing insights about awareness, preparation, and self-discipline without revealing unnecessary details about his past. His words were simple, practical, and powerful. They offered guidance, not intimidation, and gradually he became a quiet teacher in the community. The group that had harassed him eventually realized that their old tactics were no longer effective. They tried smaller provocations, but each time, he responded with calm observation and measured action, never escalating unnecessarily. They began to avoid public confrontation altogether, understanding that the man they had once underestimated would not be intimidated. The town noticed this change, and slowly a sense of safety began to return. People could move freely, speak openly, and interact without fear of harassment or aggression. Evenings became peaceful, though not without vigilance. He continued to sit on his porch, observing the town, reflecting on the day and planning for the future. His presence had become a stabilizing force, a reminder that courage and intelligence could protect a community without violence. The town, once tense and fearful, began to regain a sense of balance. Respect had replaced fear, and quiet strength had reshaped the social order in subtle but profound ways. He also began to notice changes within himself. The calm that he had cultivated during his training, the patience that had carried him through countless dangerous situations, now had a new purpose. It was not only about personal survival or skill, it was about using that strength to protect and guide others. The knowledge that his actions had inspired a shift in the town, that people now felt safer and more confident, gave him a quiet satisfaction. It was a different kind of mission, one that required intelligence, restraint, and moral clarity rather than physical action. Neighbors started sharing small acts of gratitude. Someone offered to help with repairs, another brought food, and others simply smiled and waved. These gestures, small as they were, reflected the subtle but important changes in the town. People were no longer divided by fear or prejudice. They were slowly learning the value of courage, presence, and self-respect. The influence of one man, acting with calm authority, began to ripple outward, changing attitudes and strengthening the community in ways that were quiet but undeniable. At night, he would sometimes walk quietly through the streets, checking on the town's rhythm. He noticed small details, the way lights were left on in houses, the subtle sounds of conversation from porches, the movements of people who were beginning to feel safe again. It was a gentle, almost meditative practice, but it reinforced his connection to the community. He had returned not just to live, but to create an environment where courage, awareness, and respect could flourish. The group that had harassed him was no longer the center of attention. Their efforts to intimidate had failed, and the town's perception of them had shifted. People spoke less of their threats and more about the quiet man who had faced danger calmly and effectively. Even those who had once feared confrontation began to see that strength could come from awareness, discipline, and moral clarity, not from force or aggression alone. As days turned into weeks, the town continued to heal. The events of the confrontation became stories shared quietly, lessons passed along with cautionary wisdom. Children learned, without fully understanding, that courage and intelligence could protect them. Adults reflected on the importance of standing together, of observing, and of acting with purpose. The town, once fractured by fear and aggression, began to feel whole again. He watched all of this quietly, without seeking credit. His goal had never been recognition or praise. It had been presence, awareness, and quiet strength. The town had begun to understand in subtle but important ways that courage and discipline could create safety, respect, and unity. The lessons were spreading, not through force but through example, shaping the attitudes of the community and reducing the power of fear. Even the men who had once threatened him began to reflect quietly. They understood that their behavior had consequences, that underestimating someone could lead to humiliation, and that courage and skill were forces that could not easily be broken. Some of them withdrew entirely, leaving the town in peace. Others remained, but their actions became cautious, controlled, and respectful. The balance had shifted, and the town began to feel a new kind of stability. In the quiet of the evening, he sat on his porch, the stars above reflecting in his calm eyes. The town had changed slowly but surely. Respect had replaced fear. Awareness had replaced ignorance, and courage had replaced passivity. He knew that the journey was not over, that vigilance was always necessary. But the lessons had been taught, the influence had spread, and the town was beginning to heal in meaningful ways. The confrontation had ended, but its effects were lasting. People had seen strength in its purest form, controlled, disciplined, and purposeful. They had learned that courage was not loud or aggressive, but steady, deliberate, and moral. And through it all, he remained quietly present, a force for stability, awareness, and community, ensuring that the town would continue to grow stronger, wiser, and safer. The days that followed were quieter than anything he had experienced since returning to the town. The group that had caused so much tension had faded into the background, their threats and harassment replaced by a cautious silence. For the first time in weeks, he felt that a true sense of normalcy was returning, not just for himself, but for the town as a whole. People moved about their lives with a renewed ease. Children played outside without fear, and neighbors spoke to one another with a friendliness that had been missing for too long. Even though the danger had subsided, he did not allow himself to become complacent. Awareness and vigilance had always been part of his life, and he carried them into his quiet routines. Each morning he would take walks around the neighborhood, checking the streets and noting any small changes. He observed not with fear, but with curiosity and responsibility. His presence was no longer a secret, and he understood that part of his role was to continue maintaining this sense of safety, not only for himself, but for everyone around him. He also began to invest more in the community. The fear that had once kept people silent and cautious had left a gap that needed filling. He spoke quietly with neighbors, sharing simple advice about awareness, about looking out for one another, and about small steps to protect their homes and families. He never boasted of his past, never spoke of the dangerous missions he had led or the skills he had mastered. Instead, he focused on what was practical, what was helpful, and what would create a stronger, safer community. In the weeks that followed, the town started to change in small but meaningful ways. People who had been fearful began to reclaim their confidence. Parents allowed their children to explore the neighborhood without constant worry. Elderly residents walked outside more often, smiling at familiar faces. Conversations began to take place on porches, in front yards, and at the local store, and slowly, a sense of connection and trust returned to a place that had long been overshadowed by tension. He spent time helping quietly wherever he could, fixing a broken fence for an elderly neighbor, assisting with small repairs around the homes of those who needed it, or lending an ear to anyone who wanted to talk. These simple acts of presence reinforced his role in the community. People didn't see him as a figure to fear, but as someone dependable, someone who acted with integrity, and someone whose calm strength could inspire others. His influence was quiet but profound. The group that had once threatened him remained in the background. Some had left town, some had withdrawn into cautious silence, and others still lingered but no longer dared to confront him or anyone else openly. The balance of power had shifted. What had once been a constant source of tension had been replaced with a sense of safety. People realized that intimidation and aggression no longer had meaning here. The example he had set had not only protected himself, but had empowered others to reclaim their confidence and take ownership of their own lives. Over time, he also began mentoring a few young men and women in the town, teaching them skills that went beyond physical ability. He shared lessons about focus, patience, awareness, and responsibility. He emphasized the importance of understanding situations fully before acting, of observing rather than reacting impulsively, and of using knowledge and preparation to guide decisions. These lessons were not about aggression or dominance, they were about courage, self-control, and thoughtful action. Even the children of the town began to notice the difference. They watched how he moved, how he spoke, and how he treated others. They saw courage in calmness, strength in patience, and power in knowledge. Some of them would approach him shyly, asking questions about small problems in their lives like how to stand up to bullies or how to act when someone is unfair. He answered with care, giving simple advice that was practical and moral. Slowly, he became a quiet teacher and role model, someone whose presence alone instilled confidence. He also continued to observe the town carefully. The streets, the homes, the parks, every detail mattered. He noticed changes in the behavior of neighbors, in the movements of those who remained aggressive in nature, and in the subtle shifts of the town's energy. He did not act out of fear or suspicion, but he stayed alert. Awareness had always been part of his life, and it had proven itself time and time again. He understood that true safety came from vigilance, preparation, and understanding, not just brute strength. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, he reflected on the journey that had brought him back. He thought about the quiet tension that had greeted him when he first arrived, the escalating harassment, and the confrontation that had changed everything. He realized that the challenge had not been just about physical skill. It had been about control, patience, and moral courage. He had relied on his past training, yes, but more importantly, he had relied on his judgment, his integrity, and his ability to remain calm under pressure. The town itself seemed to breathe more freely now. People moved without fear, spoke without hesitation, and carried themselves with a renewed sense of confidence. The sense of community had strengthened. Small gestures, a wave, a smile, a conversation over the fence, created bonds that had been broken by years of fear and tension. Slowly, the invisible walls that had divided neighbors and families began to come down, replaced by awareness, understanding, and mutual respect. He noticed that some of the men who had once sought to intimidate him had changed as well. Their behavior became more cautious, more respectful, and in some cases more collaborative. They had learned a lesson in humility, in the consequences of underestimating someone, and in the power of calm strength. It was not always easy for them to adjust, but the shift in the town's perception left them no choice. Respect had replaced fear, and that was a powerful force. He continued to live quietly without seeking recognition or reward. His actions were motivated by principle, by a desire to live honestly and responsibly, and by the understanding that the well-being of the community depended on steady, deliberate action. The influence he had exerted was subtle, yet it reached far beyond his immediate presence. People who had once felt powerless began to feel capable, and the town as a whole began to experience a sense of safety and unity that had been missing for years. In his personal life, he found peace in small routines. He tended to his garden, repaired his home, and spent time in the woods nearby. He walked quietly along the streets, observing, reflecting, and appreciating the simple rhythms of life. The calm he had cultivated during years of discipline had taken on a new meaning. It was no longer just a tool for survival. It had become a way to nurture strength, confidence, and hope in others. He also began to see the long-term effects of his influence. Children grew more confident, neighbors spoke openly, and small acts of kindness became common. The town, once tense and fearful, was slowly learning to value courage, integrity, and awareness. People were becoming more self-reliant, more observant, and more willing to help one another. It was a transformation that could not be forced, only guided by example, and he had provided that example quietly, patiently, and effectively. Even as the days passed, he remained aware that vigilance was important. Danger could arise anywhere at any time, but he had demonstrated that preparation, awareness, and calm judgment were more powerful than fear or aggression. He maintained routines that kept him alert and ready, not for confrontation but for protection, for clarity, and for leadership in the subtle ways that matter most in a community. The town continued to heal. Small conflicts that had once escalated quickly were now managed with thoughtfulness. Neighbors began resolving disagreements quietly, with discussion rather than confrontation. The presence of someone who had acted decisively, calmly, and morally had created a ripple effect, teaching people that courage and intelligence could change the way challenges were faced. It was a quiet revolution, one that strengthened the social fabric of the town without violence or fear. He also reflected on the personal lessons he had learned. Courage was not about force. Strength was not about aggression. True influence came from awareness, patience, and integrity. He had relied on these principles during the confrontation, and they had guided him through the weeks of tension before it. Now those same principles guided his actions in everyday life. He realized that the greatest victories often come without a fight, and the strongest protection is not intimidation but calm, deliberate presence. As the sun set each evening, he continued to sit on his porch, watching the town slowly settle into a rhythm of trust and confidence. People passed by with smiles, children played in the yards, and neighbors spoke openly without fear. The balance of power had shifted permanently. The group that had once threatened the town had lost influence, and the community as a whole had gained strength. His quiet presence had changed the dynamics of the town, not through force but through example. Looking back, he understood the full arc of what had happened. He had returned to reclaim his place, to live peacefully, and to face challenges with patience and intelligence. Along the way, he had encountered aggression and intimidation, but he had responded not with anger, but with calm, deliberate action. In doing so, he had protected himself, empowered the community, and reshaped the social landscape of the town in meaningful ways. In the final analysis, he realized that his role had evolved. He was not just a resident. He was a quiet guardian, a teacher, and a symbol of strength that came from discipline and integrity. The town had learned that courage was not loud, that power could be gentle, and that awareness could prevent harm more effectively than aggression. It was a lesson that would last far longer than any single confrontation, influencing generations in ways that were subtle but enduring. And so, life in the town moved forward, quieter, safer, and stronger than before. The past weeks of tension and confrontation became part of the town's story, a story not of violence or hatred, but of courage, awareness, and the power of calm, deliberate action. He continued to live quietly, observing, guiding, and protecting, a steady presence that reminded everyone that real strength often appears where it is least expected, and that the quiet courage of one person can change an entire community.